So let me welcome you and thank you, especially the students who made an extra effort for coming here. We all know your classes are off today, and yet here you are. My name is Basil, and today we have a privilege. We have a privilege to talk about lost tongues, found voices, and decolonizing languages smack dab in the middle of New York City with its incessant Babel of languages, voices, and it's a privilege to have this conversation with our two esteemed guests, Dinara Rasuleva and Tatsiana Zamirovskaya. I'll introduce each of our guests in due time, and later we'll have our Q&A, and I'm sure the guest speakers are looking forward to your questions just as I am. We'll start with Dinara. Dinara's talk, correct? We decided, Dinara, you would go first, correct?
I think Tatsiana wanted to go.
Oh, I apologize. So, Tatsiana, I'm sorry. Okay, so then it's my honor to once again introduce Tatsiana Zamirovskaya, a Belarusian author who moved to Brooklyn in 2015. Tatsiana writes metaphysical sci-fi fiction about memory, ghosts, hybrid identities, and borders between empires and languages. Tatsiana is the author of 3 collections of short stories and a novel, Dead Net, which was published in Moscow before the war in 2021 and received great reviews, was met with great critical acclaim, and was shortlisted in several Russophone literary awards. Tatsiana received fellowships from MacDowell, Jurassic, and VCCA, and currently, if the bio is still up to date, Tatsiana is finishing her new collection of short stories about women going through unbearable events and how these events influence language and perception. And she currently writes in Belarusified Russian, Russified Belarusian, as well as English. It's a privilege to have you here. Please, the floor is yours.
I'm a Belarusian writer who haven't been to Belarus for almost 9 years, because obviously now I cannot go back home because of repressions in my homeland. And I write fiction, though not about repressions. I would say the topics of my stories are quite weird. Like, I try to summarize the plots of some of my recent stories, and they are like this. A couple is stuck in the building during the quarantine, and they can feed only through hunting wild animals in the basement. But one of them is vegan, and there are no plants in the basement since there is no sunlight. Or, a queer woman welcomes a refugee family who is homophobic, and there are also ghosts. Or, political refugees from Belarus get teleported back to the dictatorship when they feel location-based nostalgia, because the regime created the new quantum technology that weaponizes nostalgia. So, like this, I wrote 3 collections of short stories published in Russia, and also the novel, which was extremely popular in Russia, and it's about digital resurrection and digital dictatorships. And for a while, I felt what it's like to be a great Russian writer, великий русский писатель, because first it was before the invasion of Ukraine, so it was not that bad, but at the same time, lots of Russian critics, I think if you do something good in Russia, Russia wants to appropriate you, and I had to deal with so many publications which said, young Russian writer, or top 10 young Russian writers, but I'm not that young and I'm not that Russian. So, yeah, and it took me a while to explain to Russian readers that I represent the foreign culture and that the dead dictator I'm writing about in my novel, whose mind was digitalized for him to rule the country forever, he's not Putin. And for me it was obvious because Putin would never talk this way. He would never visit a state farm and yell, "Why the cows look so dirty?" So I was like, dear Russians, please don't mix the dictatorships. Ours is very different. And we are also different, though you do understand me, but actually do you? So here's the question, why it's important for me to not be perceived as the Russian writer, though I write in Russian. And why have I been publishing my books in Russia? And why does it bother me to the extent I want to speak about it? So it's currently quite painful to admit that I mostly write in Russian, but I believe that many colonized nations of post-Soviet countries would agree with me that it's this negative side of being a Russian speaker. And I think everybody knows that Belarusians were historically deprived of their national language by Soviet Russia, by the USSR. And in October 13th of 1939, literally hundreds of Belarusian writers, poets, philosophers, thinkers, and scholars who wrote in their native language, they were taken to the forest and executed there. And it was like a whole cultural layer being erased. And I think if that had not happened, our culture and literature would be completely different. For us, Belarusians, October 30th is called the Night of the Executed Poets, and we celebrate it as like Memorial Day. In my opinion, Belarusians is something I call borderline nation, because borders really define us a lot in sense of liminality, because each century my people find themselves being in between two empires at war. And the only way to survive during this war is to be silent and to hide. And to some extent, the population of our country descended from those silent survivors of terrible things. So if you are alive, you descended from those who could hide real well and who could be silent really well. So Belarusians always refer to themselves as locals, people from here, from certain territory. And it's a very unique word. In Russian or in Belarusian it sounds like tuteshi, from the word here, tut. And this is another historical trauma I have to deal with, thinking about why Russian is my first language. To explain this, I always say my mother tongue is not my grandmother tongue, because it's never been the language my parents spoke, but they were raised by these locals, by the real Belarusians, but they didn't teach them about Belarus. For my parents, Belarusian language was a bit embarrassing, the village language, because they were the first generation kids who made it to town and who had education, and they didn't want to sound local, they wanted to be global, and Russian was a global language. So yeah, I taught myself to read Russian when I was 3 by browsing through Soviet newspapers. My parents were very proud of me, and they were like, she's going to be a writer, just like Dostoevsky, my mom's favorite writer. So when I became a student of journalism and moved to Minsk, I suddenly realized that Belarusian language is not embarrassing at all. It's not a village language, it was the language of cultural elite. So the coolest artists, writers, and poets spoke Belarusian. It was the language of resistance, language of fighting the dictatorship. And I thought, wow, this is so cool, I need to learn it. And I opened the book, my first book in Belarusian, written by Adam Globus. It was the Belarusian erotic bestiary horror. And I felt, wow, I already know the language, so I'm home. It was marvelous. But unfortunately, I couldn't write prose in Belarusian because I thought the language is so fragile and so beautiful, and I was afraid to ruin its beauty. And that's the reason. I was also afraid my elite Belarusian friends would laugh at me for saying something incorrectly. So I wrote my stories in Russian, and that was the reason I had to publish them in Russia. Because in Belarus there were not so many publishing houses, and the ones which existed, they were for Belarusian writers who wrote in Belarusian language. Some would say this is discrimination, but of course it's not, because Belarusian language is a dying language, it's almost extinct, and Russophone writers could always find a way for themselves to publish. But with Belarusian it's very difficult. Currently all of these publishing houses are destroyed, and their owners are either in exile or in prison, and all of the Belarusian language books are being published abroad, so nothing left in Belarus. So actually later, I learned from some of my friends, they also were afraid to write in Belarusian because they were afraid that their language would be imperfect. And so, since we got to this point, imperfection, this is what actually healed me. When I moved here and while I was at BART, I did my thesis about muteness, about aphasia, imperfection, and about broken speech as a metaphor and a method. So it started very naturally. I struggled with my accented English, and I felt really terrible, but after having read Jhumpa Lahiri book, In Other Words, I really recommend it to everyone. She wrote it in broken Italian to meditate over her feeling of being broken and being an immigrant. And I realized that incomplete language is a way to describe how incomplete I feel. So after I realized that actually you can write good prose in a damaged language, I also realized that languages could be totalitarian, and that linguistic dictatorships, they go hand in hand with political ones. So like this, I wrote the experimental novella in my imperfect English to finally realize I'm okay with being imperfect. And after that, my Russian also began to shift. It became fractured, slightly broken, very weird, and for me it was such a liberation, because having the bad Russian proved I'm not Russian, finally. And actually even while being published in Russia, I faced lots of accusation for not writing as a proper Russian. My editors corrected me, like, это не по-русски, that's not how we Russians speak. And for me, it's been really painful, because the same way my Russian colleagues told me they will keep that name in my country, White Russia, Belarusia, not Belarus, because this is how we Russians speak, это по-русски. So, yeah. And actually, realizing that I'm not a perfect Russian speaker suddenly made me feel very powerful. And I started writing a lot in this broken Russian. And this way I wrote a couple of short stories collection, and I wrote the novel. And it was a novel in Belarusified Russian, I think. Because I didn't use conventional metaphors, I invented my own ones. I didn't use Russian tropes or phraseology, because all of this sounded really dead and really unrealistic for me. And every time I saw I'm using a word that was influenced by English or Belarusian, or it was something not quite Russian, I loved it. And I insisted on keeping it, because I thought that the linguistic damage shows my actual human experience, and if I am the damage, let be it. And working with the editor of my novel, an amazing professional from Moscow, I mostly educated her and talked about the necessity of preserving my accent in my Russian. So when she said, it's not proper Russian, I said, perfect, let's keep it. When she said, we Russians don't build sentences like this, I said, amazing, let's keep it like this. And when she found words that exist in Belarusian but don't exist in Russian, but these sound almost like Russian, I insisted on keeping them because these words didn't have analogs in Russian. I'm gonna have some examples, like, for instance, there is no verb in Russian for gradually become calmer, поспокойнеть. Also, you cannot say I will win in Russian, because the Russian verb win doesn't exist in future tense, in like from the first person, you know it, right? Like you can say победить in the future. Also in Russian, when you say I dreamt something, it sounds like something has been dreamed into me. Мне приснилось. So something happened to me, not I personally had it. And so you cannot be an active dreamer in Russian. And you cannot be an active winner in Russian as well. But in Belarusian you can be both. You can dream, you can win, you can whatever. So like я приснил, я перемог, я перемогу. So I was enriching the Russian language with some additional usability, and this way I decolonized it slightly, and it made me feel in peace with Russian. And now I think when a Russian native reads my novel and they see some words in Belarusian, sometimes marked as words from a language which could have been my native one but hadn't become one, it's always a question for them, what it's about. And I want people to research stuff. And I think it's a challenge for translators though, but probably actually Russian is so difficult to translate from that I think translating the Russian, which was fractured by English, is easier. So, of course, unless it's not something typically Belarusian, like the curse "Холера на тебе," which means "let cholera take you away." Because my grandfather used this phrase in every situation. And so, finally, after I accepted all of my imperfections and allowed myself not to be a perfect Russian speaker, I finally started writing in Belarusian. And it's also imperfect, but I always tell to myself that my grandparents, they also didn't speak like they speak in books. They didn't read books, actually, and it's fine. And I always say to myself, I'm from here, as all the Belarusians say, I'm from Brooklyn, and my language is many tongues, and I'm fine with that. So, and basically that's it. Now I'm going to read something. How much time do we have? Oh, that was quick. Yes. Okay, I'm going to read two little pieces, two excerpts to illustrate what I've been talking about. One of them I wrote in my imperfect English, and the other one is a professional translator translation from my imperfect Russian. And you will see the difference. And the first piece is about indifference. It's very tiny. This one I wrote in English. It's an excerpt from my novella in English called Silence Fiction. It's unpublished and probably won't be ever published, but it was my thesis. All of this and indifference. One of the subway stations here is called after the B place historical figure, Kostyushka. In A place, they pronounce this name in a funny way. People in Brooklyn say Kostyushka. Sometimes they also say Kostyushko. In Russian, it sounds like Kostyushko. In B place language, it's Kostyushka. Too many shts and shts. That's almost all he knows about B place language. People in B place don't speak it that much. For him, it always sounded like a funny, distorted version of Russian. But once his roommates, some of them from B place, some from Russia, played this game where Russians had to guess the meaning of B place words just by how they sound. It was to prove that two languages are different. Шуфляда, a whore, a moth, a moldy chocolate bar, Ron, a drawer. But did they actually say drawer, for there is no word meaning drawer in Russian. They use the word shelf for a drawer and a shelf, or a box for a drawer and a box, полка, ящик. Imbric, a small animal like a rat, a frog, an eclair with cream cheese. Ron, a tea kettle, чайник. Kufar, someone who cooks, a genifying cockroach, a rare genetic syndrome. Ron, a chess box, sunduk. Porcelana, a whore, the woman's name, a scratch. Ron, it's porcelain, farfor. Malявist, bad weather, a spit, a whore, nausea, sleeping in the mud and falling down, the pimple. Ron, it's that specific state of mind we B-place humans experience regularly. We have a saying describing this kind of interaction with the world, and it's totally untranslatable to Russian, pronounced like «ахульная млявость и обаяковость добытия». It could be translated as total sluggishness and indifference to being, or general laziness and indifference to being. or universal apathy and indifference to being, or extensive listlessness and indifference to being, or prevailing drowsiness and indifference to being, or absolute lethargy and indifference to being, or unlimited languor and indifference to being, or overall fatigue and indifference to being, exhaustion, tiredness, weakness, and indifference. And when they googled that phrase, figuring out in English it's actually a quote from Heidegger, no one thought it was funny. And there's another, a totally different piece I'm going to read. It's an excerpt from the short story. It's called Can I Speak to a Real Life Person? Translated by Fiona Bell. I wrote it for a curatorial show in Vienna about animals in dictatorships. And it's the first time I wrote about the World War II and about my family story, in which I don't have anything to be proud for. It's about my grandfather, and I always ask him if he fought in the World War II, which is called Great Patriotic War in post-Soviet countries. And he never told me about his life under the occupation, and only several months before he had a brain stroke and became mute, he told me this story of how he survived. And he was that Belarusian local kid who first he was living in Poland, and then it was Russia, then it was again Poland, and then it was Belarus, the actual Belarus for a little while, and then Soviet Russia, and then it was Poland, and then Germany under occupation, and then Soviet Union again. And he never moved. He just lived in the same village all of his life. And that's why every time I asked him what's his identity, he said, I'm local, I'm from here. And like I said, most of us Belarusians are like that. We're from here, and we define ourselves not by some idea of greatness or some nation, the great nation or whatever, just by land, by place. And I think that's the reason I believe Belarusians would never invade anybody's land, because for us land is sacred. So here's the piece. We were supposed to be heroes. This is a multi-generational situation, but the reality is that we descended only from those people who didn't want to be heroes. When the Second World War broke out, my grandfather was a teenager living in a foreign country, one that quickly turned into another country no less foreign. When the war came to the village, he was already in the third country, but he didn't belong to this one either. The names of countries on the territory of his borderland village changed too often. He was almost used to living under occupation, but when the occupation ended, everyone 18 and over had to go to the front to defend their homeland and finish off the enemy. Although there was no homeland in this borderland, besides the feeling of being from this place of here-ness. All his friends over 18 were immediately sent away to become heroes. They became heroes immediately. What kind of killer does a village boy make, after all? In the span of a month, a death notice came for each boy. The male worked then as deftly as death. They seemed to be in competition. My grandfather consciously lived that year as though it was his last. He made every promise to my 15-year-old grandmother. He learned to remove bee stingers, long like bird tongues, from his fingers. He learned the language of the occupier, called mute in his language, and thus mastered non-speech, appropriating muteness as a code. With a rich set of experiences like this, he wasn't afraid to die, but he was ashamed to die young. Of course, he also received a summons to report to the military mobilization office in the neighboring village. My grandfather had no illusions about this. None of the guys called up to the front from his village had survived. People like him were usually brought in as so-called meat shields. Is your AI familiar with such a term? Allow me to enrich your neural network with meat shield. A gift from me to you. Which do you prefer, pork, beef, goose, or human? Of all the bodily temples man is destroyed in moments, like an egg. Give him a light tap and the skeletal doors open up to release a joyful liberated soul. When my grandfather was still talking, just a few weeks before he had the stroke, he told us about the day when he went to the enlistment office to join the military. He set off for the office with a friend who had just turned 18 the previous month, a smiling, burly guy with a somber Polish name. They walked through the forest, and apparently this guy suggested that they take the scenic route, since it was their last, and they went through fields and gardens. Up ahead through the cold morning mist, a kolkhoz garden floated into view. Who knows who it belonged to then, with enormous, juicy, milky scarlet apples, tempting like the cheeks of eternity. I saw those apples, my grandfather said, and thought, how beautiful. When will I eat these again? True, stealing is a crime, but I'm going to die any day now, so why not steal? And I told my friend, we're going to die anyway, let's eat apples before then. He jumped over the fence and started gathering apples in his shirt that he had tucked into his trousers. His friend was afraid to break the law, so he sat on the fence on the lookout, so that if a watchman with a shotgun appeared, my grandfather won't get shot prematurely. It turned out that the garden wasn't guarded by a watchman, but by a huge white dog. The dog flew at my grandfather out of nowhere, as if falling from heaven, and bit into his arm like a chicken's neck. My grandfather, more from surprise than pain, started pounding it on the head with an apple, which softened with each strike, and yelled, "Get off, cholera on you, get..." You're not supposed to hit dogs, but it's all right if you do it with an apple. Somehow he wriggled out from the dog's jaws and ran to the fence. "Finally, an apple for me," his friend giggled, reaching inside my grandfather's bloody shirt collar. The apple cracked in his mouth like bone. My grandfather managed to wrap his hand with a spare food wrap from his backpack. At the enlistment office, after waiting in line with similar awkward boys from neighboring villages, they each gave their name, surname, age, and place of birth. When my grandfather handed over his leathery foreign passport, the uniformed man smiled squeamishly and asked, "What's wrong with your hand?" "What?" said my grandfather, taken aback. "Unwrap it," ordered the man. My grandfather unwound the foot wrap. The blood hadn't scrapped over, and the man in the medical uniform winced again as if seeing blood for the first time. "What is that? How did that happen?" My grandfather opened his mouth and suddenly found himself saying, "We were walking through the forest, taking a shortcut. We look up and we see a dog jump out of the trees." "Whose dog?" "Nobody's dog," my grandfather said, shaking his head. "Just a dog, angry, foaming at the mouth." "Foaming?" the man asked, crumpling my grandfather's passport in his hand. "Yes, foaming, oi, oi, oi," said my grandfather, nodding. "His whole muzzle was covered in white foam. He bit my hand and ran away." The man handed my grandfather his passport. "Well, everything will heal in a couple of days," said my grandfather, "like a dog." "Foam," laughed the man. "It was a rabid dog, you idiot. You need rabies shots. Only we don't have any, so go home, my friend, and stay there if you don't, so you don't infect anyone. And God forbid you start acting fucked up. Don't you dare go anywhere. Lie down and be patient. Gnaw on a piece of wood." "I'm fine," said my grandfather. "I can gnaw on a piece of wood right now." "Go home," the man yelled, as he kicked him out of the enlistment office. "You'll come for the next call in 6 months." My grandfather's friend watched him silently, leaning against the army green fence. 4 weeks later, his death notice came. There was no next call. The war has ended. My 15-year-old grandmother, once grown, married my grandfather. Perhaps not because she loved him, but because there were no more young men in the village. They had 5 children together. He beat their children nearly to death, but it was forbidden to hit dogs in their family because a dog had saved my grandfather's life. He could never hit a dog, even though dogs were more like things for him. But things also save lives. I've often thought that if it weren't for that dog, I wouldn't be here. But what's the point of me being here? When my grandfather told me this story, he made a point to say that it was shameful, but nothing to be ashamed of. Everyone had grandfathers in the war. My classmate's grandfather marched on Berlin. My grandfather didn't want to defend anything, he just wanted to live. And I'm a descendant of a survivor. There is nothing heroic in this, but nothing shameful either. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this. I think we'll hold the questions until the end of Dinara's talk, and I hope it's not going to end soon. I really look forward to it. Let me now in turn introduce our second guest speaker. Dinara Rasuleva is a poetess based in Berlin and born in Kazan in Tatarstan, Russia. She writes in Tatar, Russian, English and German, languages she uses every day. Dinara's poetry has been described and analyzed as decolonial and feminist writing, as expressionist poetry and performance poetry. In 2020, Dinara started a feminist writing laboratory for Russian-speaking immigrants and another laboratory, if I understand correctly, for writing in native, forgotten, or stolen languages. And it's a privilege to have you here as well. And the title of your talk today, if I understand correctly, is Why Russian Speakers Get Defensive About Me Writing in My Native Language. Please.
Thank you so much, Basil, and thanks everyone for coming today. So this title is Why Russian Speakers Get Defensive About Me Writing in My Native Language. Initially, it was in Russian, and it's like white people get annoyed. But when I was performing in Westland University, my friend professor just suggested that we change people to Russian speakers because students would not understand people who. So it stayed this way. Thanks Tanya for this amazing talk, because for me we had so much in common. We have, obviously, but also from this talk, there are so many threads that come to my talk, and it's very interesting, especially this imperfection, and I will definitely come back to that, the fear of writing in a language which you're not perfect in. You think that, I don't know this language well, how can I write in it? And also broken language is a tool to actually show something, right? So I'll definitely talk about that if I don't forget. And let's start. So my name is Dinara Rasuleva. You can see in this left corner, I don't know, it's okay if I'm standing here because it's easier for me. So in this left corner you can see it, how it's written in my passport. So what do you think? How many traces of colonization or / repressions can you find in my name? Just shout out.
6.
6. That's cool. I don't know, maybe. But what we can see immediately, first of all, alphabet. And you can see here. So I'm Tatar, and Tatar language now is written in Cyrillic. But it was moved to Cyrillic forcefully in the USSR times in 30s of the 20th century. Before, it was written in Latin, but just for 9 years, because to Latin it was also moved forcefully from Arabic, and in Arabic it was probably also moved forcefully because of the Islam, which came to Tatars, and before it was written in runes, and we don't even know anything about these runes. But the thing is that, okay, I can translate my name to Latin, but I cannot, for example, write it in Arabic, and of course I cannot in runes. Then there is this Eva, Ev, like suffix, or how do you call it, ending of my name, which was also added to all names in the USSR, like Eva to female, Ev to male, Ina, in, and a lot of Turkic and indigenous peoples, they didn't have any endings. For example, in my case it would be Rasul. Also, like, sounds would be different and so on. In the end, I don't even know how many traces of colonization is there, like, for sure, but at least 2, 3 we can count. And yeah, by the way, when I'm saying colonization, I'm not it's a bit different colonization in a way of when you speak of it in here in US, I think, with indigenous peoples and Native Americans. However, when I spoke in Mount Holyoke University, I asked some Native Americans after this presentation how they feel about me saying this word and using it for this situation, and they said it's fine, so I'm gonna use it. Yeah, so why I forgot my language and wrote in Russian. Actually, I'm not even sure if I forgot my native language or not, but I'm gonna tell you this story, and probably we're gonna find out. But the thing is that I was born, and then I spoke Tatar with my grandmother and father, and I spoke Russian with my mother, because my mom went, my mom's side of family comes from the village, and my mom was the first person to kind of come and live in the city, and this was very important for her to be assimilated, and you could only be assimilated if you spoke perfect Russian. And when I say perfect Russian, it's not only grammatically correct, but also without accent, without Tatar accent, which is strong because Tatar and Russian are very different languages. Tatar is a Turkic language, and our sound pronunciation is very different, and Russian is Slavic, so it's very, very different. So there is very strong accent if you just if you don't put effort into kind of getting rid of the accent. So my mom was very, very put a lot of effort into getting rid of my accent, and that's why I didn't go to kindergarten, but when I went to school, when I was 6 and almost 7 years old, I could speak Russian without accent. And also I could speak Tatar very well. And when I came to school, and I started there, suddenly I found out that my speaking Russian without Tatar accent makes me a cool kid, because there are many kids who are also Tatars, but they speak perfect Russian, but they have Tatar accent, and that makes them a little bit worse than myself. And also because I look a lot like Slavic and Russian people, it also makes me better. So I was kind of, yeah, cool, I'm in the this cool area, almost Russian. And it was not sad, but it was somewhere in between the lines in the atmosphere that Tatar is like a country talk, provincial language, rural speech, like redneck speech, so to say. It was also translated from by that professor, because he said that redneck kind of is similar as колхозный язык, and like an uneducated and so on. However, Russian language is great educated language of intelligentsia. And when I was kind of translating my presentation to English, I just found out that actually intelligentsia is a barbarism that came from Russian language, because there is this really funny thing that only was existing there. And for those who don't know, it's cool people who are reading books, and they were kind of educated and cool. And also, at school, I just found out that there is this great Russian literature, and Pushkin, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Brodsky, and everything that you kind of need to learn, you need to read, and it's cool, it's interesting. And also by the way, why I went to school in Russian, because even though I was born in Kazan, like a capital of Tatarstan, and there is 1,200,000 people, but most 99% of schools were in Russian. So there were a couple of Tatar schools in Tatar, but they were just very much religious. So the only Tatar schools were Muslim schools, and they were just 2 for the whole city. So I just went to the closest school, which was in Russian as almost all other schools. And also universities were also all in Russian. So for example, even if you went to this Tatar speaking school, but if you wanted to go further with your education, you had to speak Russian anyways, like perfectly, just to be able to study at university. So also then I found out that it's not only in Russia that this is kind of Russian cool and Tatar rural, but also outside, in the outside world, everywhere they have kind of Slavic studies, Russian philology, and also kind of Brodsky Dostoevsky. So this is everywhere, and I was like, okay, then that is it. So I didn't even think, so you can see there this shame involved, but back then I didn't even realize that there was shame at all. It was normal, it was default, so I was just, okay, this is the rule of our life, this is the rule of the universe, and I was like, that's fine. I didn't have problem with that, because I was speaking without accent, I was looking very Russian, and that's why I was, yay, I'm very cool. And then, for this reason, I started kind of mostly speaking in Russian, everywhere except for my family. So, when, I just realized that everyone, even Tatar kids who, I knew that we both speak Tatar, but we couldn't speak Tatar to each other anyways, we always spoke only Russian to each other. So I only spoke Tatar with my family, in my kitchen or in the village when I went there for a week during the summer holidays. So it was really sealed in this super small jar of very basic kitchen family talks. So this is how my Tatar stayed undeveloped, so to say, from this age of 6 or 7. However, Russian was very much developing because I was reading all of these Dostoevsky things and also speaking to all my friends, and also at some point I started also writing in Russian, when I was 8, 9, 10 years old, my first poems and prose and everything. I was like, I never even had a choice, to be honest, so it was not a question, should I write in my native language or my non-native language? It was not a choice because we were all kind of writing in Russian with my friends, it was a very social thing, we were writing stories all together, reading to each other, so it was in Russian naturally. And for this reason I kind of started forgetting my native language, and it was not developed. But let's see. It was not only me, so it's something that we can see from this census results, that every 10 years more than 1 million people forget, and this is the question, what happens then in 20 more years, will it die out, will it be extinct, right? This is the question. However, you can see here that this is a very huge number. You can think, oh wow, this is a huge number, and it's more than Lithuanians in the world, so how can you say that it's endangered language? And I can tell you what. First of all, we don't have our country that kind of protects and wants this language to live. But also, these 2,000,000.76 people, they just said, okay, I speak Tatar, but how do they speak it? Do they read it? Do they watch television, or do they go online in Tatar? They most probably speak like myself with their family, so it's very sealed, it's very basic. Is it a language, or is it something that is not used? Is it something that is actually very, there is okay, I will go back to literature and so on. And however, Tatar is second most popular language after Russian in the modern, so to say, Russia. And there are so many other indigenous languages, like more than 100. And if we look in Wikipedia, all of them are endangered on different levels. So many of them are severely endangered, definitely endangered, vulnerable. Vulnerable is the best state of what we get. And we can see that many of them are already extinct or in critical state. Since 1994, we can see here the list of languages that have become extinct. And yeah, 119 are in the list of endangered. So the reasons are very similar to like what I already told you about this kind of this paradigm, like this overall feeling of dichotomy between kind of village language and city language, intelligentsia, intelligent language, and kind of simple language of working class and so on. But I need to tell you that I come from working class, and maybe, like Tanya, you were saying that when you came to Minsk, you found out that there are actually circles who use Belarusian to kind of as this language of intelligentsia and so on. So this is only my story, and I think that there were circles also of Tatars who were coming from a very intelligentsia kind of class, and their parents maybe were kind of Tatar professors and so on. So of course the Tatar was different. They didn't think of it as rural, but since we were coming from the village and we had to be assimilated in the city, for us it was this or die. And coming to literature. So yeah, like it's actually similar about all culture. I mean, like movies even less, and music a little bit more. But overall, like almost all literature is Russophone. To be honest, I just yeah, it's hard here. But funny thing is, I was googling this Russophone literature, and I found out that it's I forgot now, but it's in the 6th or 4th place in the world. Like the biggest number of literature was either like first of all like the 4th or 6th place of the language that is translated in the world. Did I say that you understood? So like one of the most widely translated languages in the world, but also one of the most widely written literatures in the world. However, when we look at this big bubble, not only kind of those who have Russian as their native language contributed to this bubble, but many people, like myself, who have many different native languages contributed to this bubble for the reasons that I told you. Because, for example, it's easier to write in Russian because more people will understand you, there is a higher chance of being published, and, to be honest, like myself, people just didn't think that they had any choice. And also, there were, in addition to this kind of mindset, there was also like a huge number of, not huge, but several laws that Russian Federation just put to kind of make sure that other languages than Russian are extinct and so on. For example, they made Tatar and all other indigenous languages classes in the school optional, and a lot of parents, they said, like my brother for example, they said, we don't want another headache for my kid, we'll just don't take this Tatar, which is optional, and which led to a kind of schools not hiring Tatar teachers, which led to even those who wanted to study Tatar, they couldn't because they were not teachers. But also there was another law that kind of closed the faculties in the universities that were kind of for this Tatar professors and teachers, so they were the only faculties where you could study in Tatar. It was Tatar culture, Tatar kind of teaching, whatever, and they were all closed, so they were not even, there was no more possibility to kind of become a teacher or a Tatar professor or something. And it's not only about Tatar, everything, like all these laws, they go to all other indigenous languages as well. But yeah, if we look at this, one of the contributors to this is moving to Cyrillic, because there was a big number of literature in Arabic, for example, that was not translated and will be probably lost because it hasn't been translated for a century, and it will probably not be, wouldn't ever be translated, because also people who can read Tatar in Arabic, there is like less than those people in the world. And also, there is almost no contemporary modern literature in Tatar for reasons like also that I told you, but also like there is almost no possibility to be translated in the world because world doesn't know Tatar. People are not interested in Tatar. Everyone is only interested in translating from Russian. Yeah, and when I came to Berlin, and I started like, I moved to Berlin like 9-10 years ago. I immigrated, and then before that, I was like, I didn't know this shame, I didn't realize this shame, I was just, I'm Russian, because I was kind of writing in Russian, I looked and everything, and I spoke Russian. But when I came in Berlin, I wanted to kind of explain to people that I'm from Kazan, Tatarstan. And no one knew what is Tatarstan. They all said, Kazakhstan. Always, like I say, no, Tatarstan, Kazan, Kazakhstan. So there was never ever a person who knew Tatarstan and Kazan. And somehow I became Russian, so it was like my drinking so to say. Of course I'm kidding. Of course I'm kidding. But I mean, I became Russian because I just come from Russia and I speak Russian. And this kind of feeling was very new, and I realized that in this new setup there was no this dichotomy that I had before, and on this distance from that shame that I didn't realize back then, I kind of started to realize that there was shame at all, and it was very interesting. For example, I remember once when I was writing still in Russian, like for example, you can see this book. It's my first book of poems, 99.9% in Russian, and you can later have a look if you want, and even buy. But the thing is that I still put some Tatar phrases sometimes in my poems, and once I was reading on the stage a poem in Russian, and there was one phrase in Tatar, and I forgot about it. And I was standing there on the stage, and suddenly this phrase came, and I had to read it, and I realized that this is the first time in my life when I'm going to say aloud a word in Tatar in front of Russians. Because before, it was like impossible. I would never say a word in Tatar. Like if I had to speak to my grandmother, I would change to Russian if there were my friends around. So it was the first time when I had to kind of say any Tatar in front of Russians. And at this moment I realized that there was shame before, and there is no longer shame, because these people, they don't know that Tatar is like, or was, this village language or anything. These people are completely new to Tatar. So it kind of somehow changed this shame into non-shame. I don't know how to say it, but that's what happened. But for example, here you can see one of my first novels that I wrote when I was like 10, 12 years old. And you can see very well that it's also in Russian already. And when I realized this shame, and for the first time in my life, I asked myself, wait a minute, Dinara, why are you writing not in your native language? Why? What's happening? And then that's how my project Lostlingual started. And Lostlingual, do you know bilingual? So bilingual is kind of myself, but Lostlingual because I thought that I lost one of these two languages, which like is my native Tatar. And I thought, okay, but and here it comes like Tanya. I was thinking the same. but I don't know Tatar. I forgot my Tatar, so how can I now write in Tatar if I am not perfect? But then I was perfect in poetry, to be honest. I was perfect in poetry, and I thought, wait a second, poetry is a perfect tool to kind of write in a language that you don't know. It's a perfect tool even to write in a language that you don't know at all. So you can write poetry without words. It's perfect to actually try to start writing in Tatar, even though I only remembered like several words. And that's how it started. My first poems were super like primitive, very short. For example, in this they naturally were multilingual, because this was one of the methods to kind of still write something, but not 1-2 words, but still kind of create a poem. So almost all of them had also Russian mixed, or English or German. But in this one of the first poems, there are just 3 words in Tatar. So cat, which is 2 words in Tatar, Mashe and Pasi. Pasi is a house cat that you love and you cuddle. Mashe is an outdoor cat that you don't care much, but you just feed it so it doesn't die. And here you can see just this transition from one cat to another. And the third Tatar word is meow, which is the Tatar sound of the cat, while in Russian it's meow. So here, meow, meow. So this was how I started using my Tatar in very primitive, simple ways. And you can see that I started using visuality. So before, if you look at my poems here, it's just huge kind of words, you see, like super many lines of words, nothing visual, no colors and everything. But here I thought, okay, I don't have much vocabulary, I need to use everything that I have to kind of convey the semantics. So I used all the page, all the visuals, kind of forms, colors. And then when I started posting my first Lostlingual poems on Instagram, some of my Tatar friends, they started saying, Dinara, this word doesn't exist in Tatar. And that's how I found out that some of the words, they started mutating in my head, like literally in my brain, and they kind of were mutating into the new language because they were not used for so many years. And it was an amazing understanding, and I started I left them in my poems because it's a very good, because this project is also investigation, so it was very good finding that the language is mutating. And then I also found out that I'm very illiterate in Tatar because I mostly was using it as an oral thing only with my family, and they never wrote in it. So the many words, they only existed in the oral form, even though in Russian I was real grammar Nazi. And this is also come back to what Tanya said, because I was in Russian, I was like, this is the wrong pronunciation, this is the wrong stress, you should speak correctly. And why I was like that? Because it was so important, I realized it later, for me to get assimilated into the Russian culture. And then I spoke to actually a lot of my friends who are also indigenous, and they said that all of them had very similar things. So they had to be so impeccable, so perfect in Russian, so that they became grammar Nazis themselves in Russian language. And then later I understood that actually this is the this correctness of the language, of pronunciation, of accent, also because Russians, they like in Russian culture, it's very common to make fun of different accents as well. Mm-hmm. So I just realized that this is exactly this imperialism and dictatorship that Tanya also spoke about, and I just now let myself to never speak correctly in any language. I think it's just this great freedom of speaking however I want and writing however I want. I can write with mistakes, that's fine, because it's language, it's poetry, it can be free, it can be in any way I want. I can create language, whatever. It is like I have any right to do whatever with any language. And later, the more I was writing, I used different methods to kind of dig deeper into my memory. So I was remembering different Tatar folklores, lullabies, fairy tales, mythologies, counting rhymes. I used a lot of decolonial stasis, which is like kind of remembering some tastes of food, of our kind of Tatar cuisine, and some smells. One thing that I used also a lot is ready-made poetry, because it's easy. You also don't need to know any word to use ready-made. You just use whatever is already ready. And this is a very cool poem. I'm going to read it to you, but before I'm going to explain it to you. I just used 3 ready-made things in this poem. The first one is Sak-Sok. The name of the poem is also the name of the Tatar fairy tale about 2 brothers who kind of were misbehaving, and their mom cursed them. So she cursed them, they turned into blackbirds, they forgot their language, they forgot how to speak, and they got lost, and then they were crying and they wanted to go back home. And they couldn't, because they were cursed forever, and their mom, she was also in the end crying, but she couldn't do anything, because once she cursed them, they couldn't be uncursed. And this is funny, because this is one of my first childhood memories. It was like the most popular fairy tale for Tatars. It's also in a poetic form. It's called Bait. And Sak is one brother, and Sok is another brother, and this is what I use from this fairy tale. And then a lot of these forms, like Bez Bez Bezidek, is a counting rhyme that we used in the village, because of course in the city we used Russian counting rhymes, but in the village we used Tatar counting rhymes, and this is the only I remember. Also, the third element that I use of ready-made is this and this is very funny thing, this is an announcement in the Tatar subway, Kazan subway. And it means, be careful, the doors are closing. However, all my life I was thinking that it's not be careful, but by bias, the doors are closing. And why I was thinking that? Because I didn't know the word sav, which is careful, and we didn't use it in our family. That's why I thought that it's sau bulachas, which means bye-bye. And only when I moved to Berlin, I found out that actually it's not bye-bye. And the second reason I use this phrase is because some people who live in Kazan and who are Tatars, they said to me that this is actually the only phrase that they know in Tatar language, in the native language. I'm gonna read it to you. Bez idek, bez unika kas idek, bez sak, bez sak. Bez sak, bez sak, bazratishtik bal ashadak, bez tik, bez tigas, bez jas, bez tas, kletka kedik mai ashadak, bez sak, bez sok, bez sak, bez sok, sok bulgas, bez sok buldak, sak bulgas, bez sak buldak, sau bulgas, bez sau buldak, sak bulgas, bez sak. Bez sau, bez sak, bez sok, min, bez sak, sok. И шекля, я была, была. Thanks, and funny thing is that I used 2 words in Russian here, я была, because they sound the same as я была, which means closing. But also it's metaphorically, I think, very nice, because it means I was, I were, whatever. And then, the more I was writing, I just realized that my Tatar comes back, even though I was not kind of learning it on purpose. I was just writing and writing this Lostlingual poetry, and you can see this is one of the latest one. In a year since the start of the project, I see that Tatar became more complex, it kind of took more space in my poems, the poems became bigger, but also the sentences became more complex, and even though I still used very abstract forms and I used a lot of visuality, still it's already a very different level. So it's very interesting. So this kind of investigation showed me that actually language, it's somewhere, it's just, you need to use it, and that's it. So later, I will not read it so far just because we don't have time, but maybe later if you have time. Later, I was just going around with these thoughts, like my lost language, blah blah blah. And then once I was performing in a feminist conference in Sweden, and I was giving just a little talk about my Lostlingual Project. It was 2 years ago. So, and then there were like 50 people, and I said from very different countries, and I said, if anyone has similar experience, if you can relate to what I said, please come on stage. And there were like 10 people who came, and they were from also very different places in the world. And I asked them, please write one sentence in your language that you think you lost, or maybe if you don't remember this language, you can write in the language that substituted it, colonized it. And this sentence just should express your rage or your pain about losing your language. And this is what we wrote. So everyone wrote on this big poster, and then we kind of collectively read it, and it was very powerful, very powerful. Like people were crying. Yeah, and at that moment I understood that actually like this is a common story of many people in the world, and especially a lot of people who have similar stories of their languages being Russified, right, repressed by Russian language. And that's how I started these laboratories and about writing in a forgotten language, because I realized, just like Tatsiana, that a lot of people, they don't write just because they think, I can write because I don't know, I don't remember, I know this language not good enough. But then I also realized that you don't need to know language good enough to be able to write. And actually you have to write because our literatures are being extinct, and you have to do something to kind of, you have to do whatever you can to prevent that. And that's how we started doing these laboratories, 10 weeks. So we already had 2, we had 3 performances in Berlin, and people from different indigenous peoples of Russia, of modern Russia came. I think it was about 10 or 12 languages overall, and people had very different levels of these languages, from 0 to already like a fluent, like a real native kind of level, but for example, they still never wrote in it. Still, they only used it in railway. So we were all kind of writing, poetry, everything. It was also great. So I'm going to have another one, I think, in fall. Yeah, that's how we kind of develop now and trying to revive our literatures, I think. Yeah, because also one important thing that I forgot to tell you, like even like this, do you remember this little sand, like drop in the ocean? This drop. So even this drop, what is it? So there is some kind of modern literature, but it's either children's books or it's super patriarchic, governmental, like these wild male narratives that are kind of published, and there is no like feminist, very little to zero feminist or queer literatures or like philosophic literatures or anything like that. And that's why we really, if we want our literatures to flourish, to survive, we just have to write, and that's it. Yeah, thanks everyone.
I'd like to invite you back to the table. And as per our tradition, the first question goes to the students. And after that, the conversation will be open to everyone. We have at least 30 minutes. And is there anyone among the students who'd like to ask a question? Please.
Thank you. I had a question for both Dinara and Tatsiana. So there's this expression that even though more than 2/3 of our world is bilingual and multilingual, we see our multilingual world through a monolingual lens. And you both brought up how, because of this ideology that we have to mimic like this constructed monolingual native speaker, that we have to stay behind these borders, these like socio-political borders set by nation states, that we get this like ideology of purism, that if we don't if the body of our language is not pure, then we're harming the spirit of it, that we're damaging it. And I wanted to ask you in a decolonial sense, because in Belarus and in Tatarstan, language reclamation kind of calls for this linguistic purity, this idea that, oh, to trans language is not natural, that we shouldn't dirty the language, we need to de-Russify it, we need to make sure that everyone speaks purely. I wanted to ask, how do you balance between these two ideologies, that, oh, I trans language, which is natural, and this ideology that, oh, I want to not be quote unquote imperfect, I want to keep being, like, keep striving for this purity?
It's a very good question, thank you. I think for Belarusian language, I speak for myself, but at the same time I speak for the whole Belarusians, which like whole Belarusian literature, which I think is bad. But anyway, I think with Belarusian, we thought of that, about this perspective, like this balance between being perfect, but at the same time staying, in this fragile post-colonial scheme. And I think that we could find accents within Belarusian, and this is how our literature keeps happening and keeps accepting its impurity. Because, for instance, we have a name for Belarusian language affected by Russian, dirtied with Russian. It's called Trosyanka, like the mixture, and there's the same in Ukrainian, surjik. And it's not vulgar, it's slightly cute, it's vernacular, I would say it's vernacular cuteness, but it's not bad, it's not dirty, it's sweet. And we even have some literature in this language, though it's more like a parody, but it does exist, and we have a couple of music bands who pretend to be this redneck Belarusians, but Soviet redneck kolkhoz Belarusians who sing in this surjik and this trosyanka in this mixture, and we kind of reappropriate this and we own it. So we just try to own what's been taken from us, and if they ruined it, we accept this ruin and we become this ruin. And the same with Belarusian local accents, like Polessia accent, the one which is the mixture of Belarusian, Southern Russian and Ukrainian. And recently there was an amazing book published in New Zealand by a Belarusian writer, Volha Hopolka она себя называет, she calls herself Vola from Hopol. So she literally has her name by name from the place. So it's like what I've said, it's Belarusians, they always refer to themselves as locals. So her second name is the place where she's from, Hopol. It's a place in Belarusian Polessia, the small, the little area between Belarus and Ukraine, but it's more Belarus than Ukraine, but it used to be various countries back then. And it's entirely written in this accent, in this version of Belarusian. And I'm not even sure if officially it's a language, and it's super weird, but it's so genuine, it's so amazing.
Authentic.
Yeah. Can I please ask the question again so that I freshly can answer?
Yes. Sorry. Oh, okay.
You just briefly summarize it.
Yes, I wanted to ask, you brought up this idea of purity, right? That because you're pressured to conform yourself into behind these national state boundaries. I speak Russian, so therefore I must act like this, I must talk like this, I must follow these rules that are set by a higher power, right? And I wanted to ask, how do you balance that with language reclamation for Tatar? Because it's natural, of course, to trans language in the world, to not separate languages into categories, right? And how do you balance the idea that I have to reclaim my language to the best of my capabilities, to kind of de-Russify, to decolonize it, but also admitting that it is natural for languages to be influenced by other languages, that there's no such thing as impurity in a language.
Would you like to use this mic?
For me, it's just natural because, like, for example, now you can see that I write in 4 languages, and these are languages that I use daily. And I think it's just natural that as an immigrant, as a person like who had this bilinguality or whose language was substituted, it's natural that we have several languages, and it's okay that we use all of them, and it just shows our experience, reveals our experience. At the same time, like in my Lostlingual Project, you can see that some of the poems I tried to translate back to Latin, for example, because I wanted to get rid of these trace of colonialism. At the same time, a lot of them I left in Cyrillic because this is the trace that we want to see, because this shows the history of the language being repressed. And the same with, like, my whole project is about it. You see that language is imperfect, and this shows the history. This shows why it's imperfect now, why I cannot speak it in a good level. So for me, these imperfections, they already show a lot of political and historical context. That's why I think that it's good to have them. These imperfections. I mean, if we all just say, yeah, we want to write in perfect Tatar, then like our literature will be less and less and less. And because not only because a lot of us cannot write in this perfect Tatar, but also a lot of us cannot read. For example, me coming from working class, the poems that I'm writing, a lot of my Tatar friends, they can read them because this is also the level that they have of Tatar. But a lot of us, including myself, we cannot read some of the modern complex poetry that, for example, exists in Tatar because it's too complex for us. And it's different class. So for me, the very important understanding was about class. So class is an important reason for my language being in this way, not only colonialism or Russification. And I want to let poetry or literature also be available for other classes, not only super intelligentsia.
And now let's open this for everyone, please.
Hi, hello. First of all, thank you for the permission to speak in perfect language. I'm going to use that right now for English. So my language is my question is to Dinara. What do you think, I don't know if you have in Tatarstan this kind of thing, that the young people all across Russia are, right now, I know that they are interested in somehow rebuilding, or there is a rising of interest to some national, some traditions, and including language. And they do things like, apps, language apps and things like that. What do you think about that? And do you have any hope about those kind of initiatives? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for this question. I think that it's so great that it exists and I see it. So, for example, since I started Lostlingual, I didn't learn Tatar, but I subscribed to different Tatar meme Instagram pages because there started to be these meme, is this right, the word? Pages, and when I was a teenager, when I was a young adult, there was zero. So when I was young adult, the only Tatar music was kind of super traditional, not traditional, but it was modern, but it was pop music, which only like grandmothers were listening. And it was for us as, rock, kind of how do you say it? Informale. So we for us it was zashkvarno to listen to this kind of cringy to listen to this kind of Tatar music. However, now there are a lot of bands that are really cool and rock and hip hop and whatever, and I see that this is happening not only in Tatar language and especially with Generation Z, so younger people, and I'm very happy and I have hope about it. The thing is that it happens on very different levels in different republics, and even one of my students in this Lostlingual laboratories, who is from Sakha, Yakutia, who is 20 and who speaks Sakha perfectly, but for example, he admits that he never wrote in Sakha even text messages, even though he spoke to his friends in Sakha, but all text messages they were only writing in Russian. And so, for example, music is a much better state. There is also some theaters, but literature is still at very bad state, and also it's very hard. It's the hardest of all cultural things to kind of develop, because to write a novel you need like certain knowledge. To read a novel you need a certain knowledge, much bigger knowledge than to listen to a song. So for me, I have a hope, but I have much less hope about literature, unfortunately.
More questions? Well, while you were digesting what you've just heard, I had, as you saw me writing, it was so fascinating to listen to the two of you. I had a bunch of questions. And as we speak about languages being colonized and colonizing, I couldn't help but looking at one of your last poems, Dinara, where you have English. And I wanted to ask whether English is remote enough for you not to interfere with the voice you are trying to salvage, as much as Russian does interfere with it. And in general, thinking of what Tatsiana spoke about, I think that a good parallel would be Irish and English, wouldn't it? Is it possible to forego the crimes of colonialism and yet and yet make use of a lingua franca? Is it possible actually to rise to those cultural heights without a lingua franca, or is the whole frame of cultural heights, etc., corrupt, comprised, and does it bespeak the kind of thinking you would both oppose? I'd address this question to you first, and then to Tatsiana, please.
Thanks. I just need to say that all of your questions are very complicated, but I will try to answer to some of the pieces that I can. So I was at Mount Holyoke University and yesterday, and the students actually read my Lostlingual, the whole project, which is like this already, a book, and they were making comments. And one of the very interesting comments was exactly about that. But what? I forgot now. Okay. I will start with
English being in your poem. English.
I know it's about English, but I forgot the exact comment. But that's fine. I will come back to it maybe. But the thing is, yes, I remember now. So this student understood exactly just from reading this book that English and German in my Lostlingual poems, they exactly play this role of somehow neutral languages. For me, they're kind of just connecting the parts between Russian and Tatar. Which is true to some point, because of course I don't have personal connection to English. However, this is also not so simple, because for example, when I was studying at school, and we had Russian language, Tatar language, English language, and also I had French, but Tatar was kind of the most like the lowest on the hierarchy. We didn't want to study, and our teacher was not caring, so no one was caring about us actually doing something. And English still, like, even though English was like not our native or whatever, but English was the highest in hierarchy, and everyone knew that we have to study, to learn English very, very well to be able to do anything in the world, like to become, rich and so on, to earn money. So this is already some emotional connotation, right? So even though, like, maybe consciously I don't realize it, but I think that English also substituted my Tatar in a similar way as Russian for this reason, as English and Russian were both hierarchically super high and Tatar was somewhere super low.
Hope I won't forget what I wanted to say. So yeah, it's been the same with us in our Belarusian schools, because English and Russian were like top languages which we needed to know perfectly. And in our Belarusian school in a very little town, English was praised as like the best language in the world, and we had to learn it, otherwise we won't be educated people. And Russian the same. And Belarusian was so. So I think the first language I learned was Russian, then the second was English, and then it was Belarusian, and then I moved to America and I realized that the English I know, it doesn't work here at all. It's totally different. So it's been a very Soviet version of English. And also, for some reason before immigration, I had a great fear that living in an English-speaking environment will fracture my native Russian. Just not even a language, but like my personality is going to become somehow fractured by the language, since I believe in this Sapir-Whorf theory that language influences the consciousness. And I was terrified that one day I'm going to speak in this Runglish, just like this imaginary women from Brighton Beach, you know, how they speak like Naslice, it's called Pounda, and they mix the languages. And it probably it is funny, but for me it was terrifying. And once I realized that I finally start talking like this, I can remember a word in Russian, but I remember the same word in Belarusian or English. So these two languages, English and Belarusian, like less active languages in my life, they started to substitute each other. And I had this mixture of Russian and English finally, and then I thought, oh, this is so cool, because since 2015, I've been always thinking that I speak this colonizer language, the Russian, and then I switch it to another colonizer language, the English. And then I see one of them is like two empires are fighting, amazing. Russian is fighting English, English is fighting Russian, and I'm just watching how it happens in my brain, perfect. So I just let these things happen, and I just watched my personality grow into something else, and I was happy with that. And now I see that sometimes when I write my short stories in Russian, and I know they will be translated, I see that I write them in a very English type Russian with the American, like I build the sentences in a way for a translator it will be easier to translate into English. So I imagine how this is going to look in translation, and so I cannot undo this. So every time I write in Russian, I'm like, do I want this to be translated? Of course I do. So that's why I build my sentence like this, because it will be easier. So I always think to simplify the work of the translator. I still hope the translators will be human for at least several years in the future, or maybe generally in the future. Maybe it's not that perfect, hopefully. So, yeah.
It's perfect.
May I know it's unprofessional, but I'll just add something real quick. Do you know that when Google translates from Ukrainian into English, it first does so for Russian? So Ukrainian, Russian, English. And then when you use ChatGPT, the structure for Russian is very Anglophone. And wouldn't that go against Whorf and Sapir with their language relativity theories that simply put good or bad, in your opinion? Could I ask you this follow-up question real quick?
AI doesn't have consciousness, so I don't have an answer to this question because I'm scared.
Sorry, thank you. More questions from the audience? Coming.
First, I would like to apologize for my question, because it probably should not even been asked, especially in this audience. But I am personally very interested in this. There is a theory that some part of Russian language come from Tatar language, and I'm talking about Russian math. So how you translate Russian math from Tatar from Russian to Tatar or to Belarusian or to any other language? If I know that you don't use it in your writings, but maybe from other writings that usually that use sometimes these curses or whatever. So I'm interested. Does this theory hold on about that it comes from Tatar, and from your point of view, and how it could be translated if you ever meet it in other literature? That's it. Thanks.
We, like in Tatar, we have our own mat, so our own cursing, which is very different from Russian cursing, and that's why, in my experience, this theory is not working. However, it might be that there is something that we don't know. It might be that long time ago it somehow came. Because, for example, it's a very fun story. I met a colleague of mine who is from Hungary, and we were talking, and he said that earlier their peoples were living on the Kamskaya Usya, which is in Tatarstan, and I was like, wow, this is where I come from. And he said, yeah, we were living there, and then some of our like the I don't know, like how do you say it? The предводитель or what, Khan?
Khan.
One of the Khans, he was just chasing the deer, and that's how they became in the modern territory of Hungary. However, because of this history, they have a lot of Tatar words in Hungarian language. And this is so interesting, I would never expect that. And also Hungarian, like Tatar, doesn't have gender, like it's also ungendered, so we have many in common. So it could be that there are things that came from very, very early ages and we don't know about it.
Yeah, and actually we also have our own curses in Belarus. And like I said, the one is connected with cholera. It's this very European medieval curse, I think, not just like Russian. Also, I just tried to Google this curse, which I absolutely love. So I didn't Google it. I couldn't find it. But as far as I remember, it's как твои дети твоими костями груши обтрясали. Which it's like let your children shake the pears from the tree with your bones. And it's much better than Russian curses, but I do use Russian curses in my writing. So every book of mine published in Russian now have the sticker, huge yellow sticker with 18. So in Russia you can use the edge, you can start drinking and reading my books, use the same. And it says, careful cursive words, like бранная, нецензурная брань, like curse language, obscene language.
Profanity.
But I still use it because every time I'm angry, even in real life, I use Russian curses because Russian is a language of aggression, right? So anytime I feel aggression, Russian helps me. I'm like, okay, Russian, I'm going to use it for what you've been actually designed for. So it's okay, yes, Russian math is fine.
For me as well, I use sometimes Russian math. I think it's fine, whatever. I mean, we can use anything, right? We can create our own math. So I think that's fine. Thank you for the question.
Still have some time for questions. Are there any more questions from the audience?
It is a question for Dinara. While you were speaking, I cannot escape the urge. I found an earlier text of yours from 2020. It's a review, we mentioned it before during the break. So when you were writing, you were contrasting your poetry to poetry of other poet, and you wrote this. Разница в том, что Юлия проводит сильное противопоставление России и Беларуси, тогда как я пытаюсь Татарстан из России выудить, отделить, но он так в ней растворился, что в руках у меня остаются только жалкие обрывки языка, фольклора, традиций, Туганьяк, Родины. I remember how so it is, like, translated briefly, the difference is that while another poet is maintaining a strong opposition between Russia and Belarus, I try to get Tatarstan out of Russia and separate it, but it is so dissolved that in the end I only have pathetic scraps in my hands, language, folklore, traditions, Duganyak, motherland. So it was like very striking for me back then when I read it. By the way, like this review came out on February 14th, 2020, which is like very like canonical date, I'd say, both year and month and date. And I was wondering, how did that change since then? Because like it's 4 years before, and I'm wondering how this выудить, выужение, getting Tatar out of Russia works for you, because from what you were speaking, I kind of feel that you're now also maintaining a position, like much, like this opposition to imperial discourse, like I would say like more apparent in what like I hear now from your poetry, but that's like my perception, as if like it intensifies, at least like this выужение seems to be successful. You seem to be like very, I don't know, like it feels like the process is going. But what's your experience with that? Thank you so much for both of you for being here tonight.
Thank you so much for this question. It's amazing that you quoted me and I don't remember these words. It's a surprise for me. But okay, I need to then assume that I thought like that. And well, I think that this is still a process, because like you see, I always use still Russian words in my multilingual and poems, even when Tatar like is 99%, but still there is some Russian, and I think it's something like unavoidable, just because that's what I am. Like I cannot just cancel some part of my identity. This is part of my identity, of course, because my whole life I was speaking Russian. I cannot just say I'm only Tatar and Russian language doesn't exist in myself. I have this whole book of poems in Russian, and it's like something, of course, that exists in myself, and I cannot just say it never existed and doesn't, and I'm just, closing it. That's why I think that the process that is happening is that to bring some Tatar from the depths where they were buried, so to bring it on the surface a little bit, and unavoidably it's getting mixed with this Russian kind of identity which was there before. But I don't think that ever it will become separate, because this is something that always existed in me in parallel. So, and I think it's fine. I think this is what reflects my experience, and this should be like that. It's fine that it's like that. I still speak Russian to majority of my friends, just because it's historically, even though we're from different countries and different cultures and also have different native languages, but that's how it is.
Tatsiana, did you want to answer this question, or shall we have another one from the audience?
Maybe another one.
Absolutely. We can do second rounds unless there is someone who'd like to ask a question for the first time. And I think we in general have time for maybe a few more questions, and then we could proceed unofficially already. Please.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you for the second question. Can I ask you, Dinara, another question? Which of these three alphabets, Russian, Latin or Arabic, you said that none of them are natural for Tatar language, but which of these three would you prefer? Like, which of those do you like for Tatar language to be used? Thank you.
Thanks. I didn't say that.
Why?
Yeah, I didn't say that they were natural, because this comes a little bit like it's history, so it's natural. They just, it's like, it's a big fight from people, grammar Nazis, Russian grammar Nazis, about feminitives, because they say it's not natural for Russian language, but anything that happens in the language, any changes, they are natural, because this is how historical language changes. Well, that's the same about Tatar. I mean, it's just history, and even though it has some colonial traces, traces of repressions, but that's how it was, so I think that's natural. However, Cyrillic, for example, it's not meant for Turkic languages, and that's why it's not perfect to express, to pronounce Tatar sounds. For example, of course, they added some letters to kind of Russian alphabet. They added some additional letters that are only Tatar and other Turkic languages. However, it still doesn't express correctly the Tatar pronunciation. For example, there is this K or K, which is like K. It's written still in one letter K, the same. However, you can, like, only those who are Tatar speakers, you cannot kind of teach it in school how people would not understand how should I pronounce K or K, because there is no separate letter for K. They are all written in the same way. So I think that Cyrillic is not meant. And it's not perfect, maybe. Maybe we need to invent another alphabet. So
we use Georgian, we have a lot of
But I know the question was not for me, but just for your information, I wanted to add that in Belarusian we also have the Latin way of writing stuff. And I think historically it's also connected that Belarusian was Polonized, influenced by Polish Empire, in the same way it was influenced by Russian one. So basically there always were two ways of writing in Belarusian. And I myself, once I started doing journalism in the 90s, I perfectly could write both. I could write Latin Belarusian and I could write the Cyrillic, but at the same time we had two Cyrillic versions which had always been fighting, like Belarus, like people who were studying Belarusian or writing in it, there were like two teams which were greatly opposed to each other, because one version of the grammar was more Russified and another version of the grammar was a bit Polonized. They were called Tarashkevitsa and Narkamovka, and one of them highlighted the specific Belarusian pronunciation with this, I don't know even how to explain, but there were so many mягкие знаки and the words were softer, and the other was more Russified and it sounded in a more Russian way. So far up to this moment, Belarusian language media operates in these two versions of Cyrillic Belarusian, which have totally different pronunciations. And we have two Wikipedias, or maybe even three Wikipedias. I think we have the Latin one too.
And one thing I wanted to add about Belarusian language actually also was written in Arabic before as well. So there are more similarities between Tatar and Belarusian that one might think.
Because we have Belarusian Tatars and we have Alkai in Belarusian.
I think we have time for one last question. And since,
that's my first
yes,
one.
that's your first one, please. And after that, we can proceed unofficially. Yeah.
So, first of all, thank you so much for your presentations. It's quite inspiring and liberating, I would say, for all of us who wasn't taught properly for their native language. And I would like to ask, so now I can see clearly the image of a writer or a poet who's writing in this broken language or lost language. And how do you imagine your reader? Who are you speaking with in this language? And have these people, your readers, should be like you? Should have they be like bilingual or trilingual, or how do you imagine your perfect or just reader?
I have the answer. I mean, I have my own experience, because recently I tried to do the thing I would never think I do, because before I thought it's bad to mix Belarusian and Russian on the same level. I wrote a short story, even a novella. It's not a short story, it's a long story, the one about quantum teleportation and dictatorship and the weaponizing of nostalgia. And two main characters of the story, they speak Russian and Belarusian. It's a couple, and a girl speaks Belarusian, not a perfect Belarusian, of course, and the guy speaks Russian, and they're fine talking like this. And for me, it was not a statement. I didn't want to emphasize that the languages are equal. I just wanted to show how we actually speak, because this is how I speak to my friends. This is once I had a Belarusian speaking boyfriend who hated Russia so much. He only spoke Belarusian, and I answered him in Russian, and it was fine. We were like bilingual couple. It was okay. It was many years ago. Now I wouldn't do this. Whenever someone talks Belarusian to me, I reply Belarusian. Definitely. So I switch language according to whom I'm speaking to. But this short story, for some reason, it became so popular among Belarusians because everybody was like, this is the way we actually speak. You finally wrote something in the way we think and we speak, because this is all mixed up in our heads. So until you doesn't try, you don't know who is the reader, and whenever a weird thing you are trying to implement in your writing, you suddenly can find you have much more audience that you even hoped to find. So I think my answer is that the more I try, the more weird audiences I'm going to see, and maybe it's not even that weird.
And I would say that I think my audience is everyone, because for several reasons. First reason is translingual, multilingual. So whatever, if you understand only English or if you understand only Tatar, you will understand something from the poems. And even if you understand one line, you will already grasp some semantics for yourself. You already get something from it. However, even if you don't understand any of these languages, poetry still is understandable. For example, I was performing once in Tokyo, and people there noticed they didn't understand a word. However, they came to me after and they said, wow, this was so powerful. I didn't understand a word, but I understood everything through the sound, through the emotions and intonations.
Remember, I had the same with your reading. I think it was something like a podcast where you've been speaking Tatar, and I started listening to it, and I was so fascinated. I was like, wow, this is so interesting. This is so meaningful. And I wrote it to like, oh, it was so good. I listened to it like from the beginning to the end. It was so good, but I didn't understand a word, but I understood everything. So yeah.
So thanks, Tanya, for confirming. And I think that it's just for everyone, and also this. I think the important thing is the power of sound and how it reacts with our bodies, and it's like a little bit like dancing, I think.
Yes, indeed. Concluding, I must add that that's what T.S. Eliot said. Genuine poetry communicates before it is understood. And I also wanted to say there was so much wonderful humor, real humor, and you've shown its liberating potential in helping us cope with trauma. And I wanted to thank you for this personally, to you. I also wanted to thank our wonderful audience and draw your attention to our website. In fact, some of you don't know it. To the left. I'm sorry, I'm not too tech savvy.
Okay, let me try.
I think that's, yeah. If we could just go to that webpage, I wanted to remind, thank you so much, everyone, of our wonderful website run by Professor Klotz and the team, Russian and East European Cultures, reeechunter.com. If you haven't done so already, I suggest you subscribe. And I think that this extraordinary event speaks for itself, and we look forward to seeing you. And now we could proceed unofficially for some more time if you are willing to. Thank you very much once again.